Now I will hand over to you, Bray. Thank you for moderating, and Andre, of course. We are so excited to learn from your expertise today and come away with some valuable and important lessons for the field. Bray, it's over to you, and I will advance slides as you need me to.
Okay, thanks so much. So I'm Bray Patrick Lake. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Evidation Health, and I'm just really excited about this discussion today. I've been following Andre's work and what he's been doing with Onboard Health, and I'd really love, before we dive into even the presentation, Andre, if you would just speak a little bit about your background and experiences and how you got to where you are and founding Onboard Health.
Absolutely, Bray, and thank you once again, everyone, for inviting me on here. Extremely excited for this discussion, especially during these times that we're in now. So a little bit about my background. Over the past decade and a half, have really been immersed in kind of the intersection around public health and healthcare, particularly with a lens on innovation and technology and digital strategy. My career got started in public health and a lot of research and health comms. And then I started writing about it on the Pulse and Signal blog back in 2007, which was essentially the golden age of social media and blogging. And that really afforded me just an amazing platform to connect with people literally from around the world who were working on behavioral health, public health, health tech. This is when, digital health startups were just kind of getting going. And it really just kind of allowed me to see the beginnings of what we're seeing right now. And so over the past, 15 or so years, I've just, been really fully immersed in this landscape and, working around communications, the startup, advisory landscape and that sort of thing. And so over time, I really got just a great view of what it takes to create the future of health, particularly from a sustainable landscape. And so, back in 2016, I had this amazing moment where I had an invite to go back to my alma mater at the School of Public Health at University of Maryland and give the commencement address to the outgoing class. And it was at that time where it really just kind of sat with me around what the future of the workforce was going to look like, particularly seeing this intersection of upstream and public health and the social determinants and traditional healthcare and medicine. And for me, it really kind of signaled that there's an opportunity here now to equip the workforce with the kind of skill sets and community and resources that they needed in order to be effective. And all of that with the lens around diversity and inclusion. It's going to take everyone and lived experiences and backgrounds and skill sets of all different kinds in order to really kind of build and bake it into our society. And so for the past, 3 years now, really been focused on growing the talent community at Onboard Health. Really, once again, connect, equip, and launch has been like the 3 pillars of what we're building here. And really building this, talent community of people that may or may not have backgrounds in public health and healthcare, but know that their skill sets can go toward building a sustainable future of health. And that's really kind of where everything got started.
That's amazing, and I'm sure you'll get to this, but just even the, the mission of Onboard Health, I think is so powerful. If you could speak a little bit to the specific mission of just the company itself.
Absolutely. So from a future of health and sustainability, concept, as we're starting to see a lot of these kind of companies look at, once again, this intersection, there's really going to be a need to make sure that we have teams and especially leadership that reflect the diversity of our society. If we're tackling, mental health and technology, who are the kinds of, groups and communities that need, the most kind of interventions and solutions, right? If we're looking at diabetes or heart disease, we definitely know that that women and people of color, generally have, more of disparities and inequities in these kind of spaces. And so if we're able to if we really want to create solutions and products that are long lasting, that are deeply valuable, that meet the needs of everyone that we're, building health with, it's absolutely critical to make sure that that's a reality. So the mission of Onboard Health is really to build a more diverse and inclusive workforce ecosystem to power the future of health. And so what we're really focused on is making sure that there are accelerated opportunities for individuals who want to figure out how they can use their data science skill sets to, work on chronic disease, or how people can use their communication skills to, build, food sustainability startups and things of that nature. And really kind of plugging amazing talent into these kind of, organizations and venture-backed startups that are building the future of health. So I call it an ecosystem because there's just opportunity, once again, to connect with each other as practitioners and professionals. Oftentimes that has been something that has not been around. There's, so much opportunity to say like, hey, I didn't know that people who had MPHs were interested in UX, right? And design thinking, and, making those kind of connections is so critical for the workforce. And then making sure that they have all the opportunities and resources to continue to be successful.
Yeah. Well, we will, after we hear your presentation, I look forward to talking about kind of priming the pipeline. I know some of these rooms are hard to get in, and when we're building this new workforce, that's what's so exciting, is that from the ground up, foundational, we can create opportunities to make sure that everyone is included.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think, Jen, maybe we could cue the slides.
All right. So once again, hello, everyone. I hope everyone is, safe and washing your hands for 20 seconds. And just overall, just being really mindful of the climate that we're in now. This is why this is such an important discussion. And I'm, once again, really excited to move this forward. So, here, as I was mentioning before, with this intersection of a lot of kind of public health and prevention concepts, as well as traditional medicine and healthcare, there's so many more, factors that are coming out now that are impacting our wellness and are creating opportunities for sustainable solutions around, promoting health and preventing disease. Next slide, please. And so it's really an exciting time because, once again, we have this, combination of upstream and social determinants merging together with modern, medicine and healthcare, and, calling that upstream healthcare is kind of, what I have here. But also, as we combine that with, diverse talent that, once again, comes from various backgrounds and skill sets, and, once again, racial, ethnic backgrounds, more women, more people from the LGBTQ community who have lived experiences and various insights, really kind of, build this combination, this equation for more innovative and, more importantly, relevant solutions, right? So, once again, like when we're looking at the space now, there's a lot of opportunities for tech to be at the forefront of a lot of, solutions. But once again, we really need to focus on making sure that things are relevant and valuable to the communities. Next slide, please. I think that skipped forward a couple slides.
Oh.
Uh-oh. And while we get back to the slides there, I mean, like, once again, it's so absolutely important that we address health at its deepest roots, especially now that we're starting to look at, so many different narratives around historical inequities and things that have happened at the policy level and things of that nature that have really kind of embedded, a number of different aspects to our current healthcare landscape. Once we have leadership in place that understands these kind of concepts, that's when the real solutions actually begin. So that's why it's so important to have, more inclusive and diverse talent at the table that understands these kind of concepts and say like, hey, you know, this may not be the direction that we might want to go. This is actually more tone deaf, especially as we know, you know, what's at stake here. So that's what we have, you know, going on right now. You know, looking at these kind of areas now that, you know, especially, you know, happening right now with coronavirus. Oh, I think we lost the slides.
I think we have some kind of tech delay, so just bear with us while we find the slides again.
Yeah.
This is the fun of everybody suddenly transitioning to the home workforce where the bandwidth goes way down and then there's the delay.
Absolutely. That literally happened to me yesterday. But I'll say one of the aspects of that, the slides around what's at stake now has to do a lot with trust and misinformation, right? You know, as we're looking at, you know, widening the lens on what health actually means, you know, the aspect of trust is absolutely critical. And we're seeing that play out right now, you know, who to trust. You know, does this leader necessarily have my community in mind as they're telling me, you know, various kind of things to do and things I need to do? They understand the needs that we might be having, right? And so once again, like if we're tying this back to inclusive and diverse leadership, that's at stake here. You know, it's making sure that we have the right people in place that represent our communities, the patients, the overall consumers, especially leading during times of crisis. And so once again, obviously with misinformation, right, like that is literally something that has to get mitigated from the start. And as we're talking about, you know, various cultures and things of that nature, you know, the misinformation, you know, where to go for that kind of information. If there's leadership that represents the communities that make up our society there, that mitigates a lot of that, right? And so that's why it's so important, specifically when it comes to healthcare. Another piece of the puzzle that's at stake right now around healthcare are just the massive amounts of data that we have going on right now, right? I mean, from wearable devices to our phones, to the websites that, you know, have a lot of our, you know, health information, you know, especially as the consumerization of health continues, as you see down here. There's just so much at stake here. And so this is, yeah, so this is the slide here around just, you know, looking at ourselves here, right? You know, this is not something where, you know, we can just kind of have a blanket statement around, you know, populations or consumers, right? Like, you know, everything that we're talking about today and in healthcare will eventually affect us and will affect our families at one point, right? So that's why, once again, here, it's so important just to, once again, just kind of take a step back and think about what's actually at stake. And it's us, it's our communities, it's our families, it's our friends. Next slide, please. I think that was a slide on why inclusion matters. There we go. So once again, you know, why does having an inclusive lens for all this even matter? And a lot of it has to do with, I think you gotta go back. Having an inclusive lens is increasingly important because, once again, if we're looking at how this intersection of, you know, how health is built into our society, how people have access to care, access to, you know, mental health services, things of that nature, we really cannot move forward effectively without understanding, you know, that there's things like, you know, unconscious bias, that there's stigmas out there. And we're going to get into that really soon with some examples that I think everyone can really understand or kind of, you know, relate to. But this is why inclusion matters, right? Because of these kind of things that are now surfacing and coming to the forefront. of healthcare and medicine is that, you know, these are the things that have existed and have been built into our system that we need to, you know, really take a hard look at if we actually want to make sure that, you know, we're building the future of health properly. All right, next slide, please.
So bear with us while we work through these technical difficulties. Let me see if it's possible for me to share. It's going to take us just a second. And yeah. Andre, I don't know if you want to just keep further exploring this theme. I know that there's been so much. I mean, even in the news today, if you look and you see people that are making the public health decisions and they're in no way reflective of, you know, your community. Or, you know, we've heard so much about, you know, the trust deficit and different solutions are being developed through AI. And if you know the workforce isn't representative, you know, it deepens that trust. So, or that deficit in trust. And so just thinking about some of the practical things, I think we might have to reboot this webinar. So just stay on and keep talking. We'll do what we can on the slides. Just a second.
Absolutely. But you're absolutely right, Bray. I mean, this once again goes so deep into all the different aspects of what's going on right now. You know, one of the aspects that, you know, that we can definitely touch on, we will, is, you know, this touches everyone, you know, from, you know, celebrities, you know, highlighting, you know, Serena Williams and looking at, you know, infant mortality and maternal mortality around Black women, right? You know, even, you know, as we have built so much trust around physicians and things of that nature, there's still, you know, issues, you know, at stake around the kinds of care that we all get, right? And so you mentioned, you know, AI and precision medicine, right? Like, you know, this was kind of my point around the innovation concept, right? We have so many amazing opportunities and platforms that seem to be, you know, poised for, you know, changing the game in healthcare. But once again, if we're not taking the time to address these kind of aspects of bias and, you know, frankly, things like institutionalized racism and things like that, we run the risk of a lot of those kind of, you know, innovations being built improperly. So as we talk about machine learning and AI and things of that nature, we have to think about, you know, who is programming, you know, the computers that are evaluating these kind of things, right? As we look at, you know, being in the world of facial recognition, right? And tying so many disparate pieces. This is that other point about, you know, what's at stake around all the data points that are coming together. If we're tying together facial recognition that's flawed with data sets that are also flawed, right? Like, you know, the algorithms tend to, you know, create very kind of warped opportunities, especially for people of color and people from underrepresented groups. And so once again, like, one of my main points when it comes to talking about these things is that, you know, it's not necessarily just a nice to have kind of thing, but it's definitely like a need to have, right? Because of what's at stake here. And it's so incredibly important to make sure that we understand that at its root, so that before we kind of take steps to, you know, really look at the future of health, we really need to kind of look at what's been done and how we can mitigate those kind of issues. You know, once again here, I just want to just kind of talk a little bit about, you know, setting the table for just the opportunities at play. Once again, looking at the intersection of a lot of the social determinants and upstream opportunities with traditional healthcare. So first, you know, here, you know, mental health disparities among vulnerable populations. I'm so incredibly excited to see amazing new ventures and companies and solutions, you know, finally tackling mental health and really kind of, you know, removing the stigma around, you know, mental health and access to care and things of that nature. One of the companies I'll talk about later on is, you know, Henry Health, that's, you know, looking at tech-enabled solutions for Black men in our country, which once again is part of the vulnerable populations piece, right? So we're seeing these kind of companies and ventures popping up, things like access to healthy foods and a deeper understanding of how to eat, you know, ways to design spaces and places that promote long-term health. So, you know, looking at, you know, city-based interventions that, you know, relate back to health. And then finally, this is really important, is as companies, you know, looking at how narratives surrounding lived experiences actually impact behavior. And this, you know, goes toward internally, you know, both with, you know, staff and employees and the workforce, but also the people that we're serving in these areas as well. So storytelling, I think, is coming back in a big way. And being really focused and intentional about inclusion and diversity is so incredibly important with that. Next slide, please. And really quick here, this is, you know, just another kind of example of, you know, how we're building health into our society. And once again, as we give everyone access to take care of their health better, whether that's kind of, you know, walkable cities and creating, you know, access to new or, you know, more effective modes of transportation right here, you know, as you know, we see here, like with, you know, city bike and things of that nature, that is, once again, incredibly important. Next step, please. And so once again, really quickly, we talked about what's literally at stake. And if nothing else, where we're at right now with the coronavirus response, all of these things, you know, make a lot of sense. So once again, with the healthcare landscape now, we're really looking at things like trust and misinformation or miscommunication, you know, the amounts of data that's being produced, the outcomes actually, you know, that are now aimed at disparities, the consumerization of health. So those are a couple different aspects of where overall we're at now. Next slide, please. So, you know, once again, like a quick statement here is that lived experiences and representation matter. And that's going to be a big part of, especially as we're living in this kind of value-based care climate, making sure that we're really paying attention to who we're serving and making sure that their stories and their experiences are built into the solutions that we're creating are going to be essential for long-term success. All right, next slide, please. All right, so here's the example that I was mentioning before. So Serena Williams, you know, one of the best athletes in the sports industry right now, just the epitome of strength and perseverance. You know, during her pregnancy with Olympia, like the whole kind of situation really turned upside down, and a lot of it had to do with stigma and bias and just an inability to get past a lot of stereotypes, especially when it came to Black women. And once again, it was a life or death situation, you know, that oftentimes plagues a lot of, you know, women in our society. Next slide, please. So, you know, according to, you know, the CDC and a lot of the reports that have come out recently, especially this year, as we looked at maternal mortality rates, Black women are still the most adversely affected. And a lot of this has to do with, once again, if we're looking at disparities and health inequalities, but also looking at the workforce that we have inside of healthcare as well. It's tremendously important to make sure that our physicians, that our nurses, the workforce in general understands these kind of concepts so that, once again, we can take better care of the people that we are supposed to be taking care of. Next slide, please. So once again, it's absolutely critical and important, especially in healthcare, that we have the people at the table in leadership that reflect the diversity of our society in order to create those kinds of sustainable solutions, products and services. Because, you know, to be completely honest, we're living in a time right now where people are looking to see themselves represented. They're looking to see if organizations, and especially in health, are meeting their needs, whether that's fertility or general overall health or chronic disease or mental health. These are the things that are you know, creating sustainability and also business ROI for the companies in healthcare right now. Next slide, please. So once again, as I mentioned before, we're now in this kind of innovation landscape where, you know, things like technology and design thinking and user experience design and data science are really at the forefront of what it looks like in healthcare. And that's something that we need to like keep in mind, especially as we think about talent and the workforce who are at the helm of these kinds of areas. Next slide, please. So once again, looking at, you know, the consumer landscape and who has, you know, who has the ability to shape markets right now, and especially, you know, as femtech or, you know, technology that's aimed at women's health has been exploding over the past few years. Femtech is expected actually to be a $50 billion market by 2025. And, you know, once again, just kind of keeping that in mind, you know, if companies are, you know, wanting to help serve women's health, it stands to show that, you know, you need to have women as part of your leadership, right? It only kind of makes sense, once again, if you're tackling, you know, issues that are related to various groups across our country, that they are represented at the leadership and across the board at the company. So once again, you know, we're looking at a whole kind of innovation and refreshment of, you know, specific areas like mental health or fertility and pregnancy, you know, general health care, nutrition, all those kind of different things are, you know, creating this expansive new market in healthcare. And so specifically for traditionally underrepresented groups, you know, there's an economic perspective here around, you know, buying power and, you know, the influence of the consumers and patients who absolutely need to feel that they're represented in the products and services that are coming out. So, you know, companies like DrugView, for example, is a new startup that's focused on clinical trials that better represent people of color. And clinical trials has been traditionally kind of lacking in that space. And as we all know, you know, that's an important part of how, you know, solutions are created. And so once again, this goes back to that root aspect of like who's programming the technology for these kind of products around AI and machine learning, who's being part of the clinical trials that, you know, inform the solutions and medications and things of that nature that come down the line. So next slide, please. So as we're thinking about, you know, what we can actually do, especially inside of our companies, I want to just kind of pull together a number of different questions that, whether you're in leadership or you're part of a committee, these are the kind of things that you want to bring up, you know, inside of your organization as you're thinking about strategies to be more inclusive with the work that you're doing. So who are the leaders and innovators in this landscape that are working on the problems that you are? Once again, whether that's chronic disease like diabetes or heart disease, or if you're into mental health or behavioral health, who are the individuals that have stood up and built platforms that you can learn from, especially as they represent, you know, more diverse populations? Who are the companies and other startups that you should be paying attention to and most likely supporting? So like I mentioned, DrugView is a startup that's focused in the clinical trial space, but we also have companies like I mentioned, Henry Health, that are doing amazing work specifically for Black men in mental health using a tech-enabled platform. Health in Her Hue is another great example, led by Ashley Wisdom, to once again fill that gap around, you know, women of color and finding physicians that that understand their needs and filling that gap. You know, that build that kind of trust that we talked about as well. So really paying attention to the kinds of companies and startups that are out there also in this space. You know, and oftentimes we hear, you know, we don't know where to go to find the pipeline, or we don't know where to go to find more diverse talent. So a big part here, you know, here is a question around how are you showing up in the spaces and places that people are learning or doing to craft the future of health, right? So, you know, once again, you know, it's less of, you know, one-off, you know, kinds of initiatives, and how are you actually appearing where people are, where they're asking questions and things of that nature. Next slide, please. And a few more questions here. How are you showing authority and an affinity toward common goal solutions in these places? So, once again, with, companies like Henry Health, they're showing up as an authority among Black men in the community to say like, hey, we actually are, seeing and meeting your needs, and we want to help. And so they have, a number of larger companies that are partnering with them in order to build this ecosystem around mental health and impact and access to care. So, once again, like, how are you saying that, we are going to be a leader in this space here, and we know that we need to connect with the right kinds of individuals? And a couple other questions here are, what would ideal partnerships look like for you to stay relevant and to continue learning? What are the market trends that you should be paying attention to? And finally, how are you creating resources for thought leadership so that you show up as people are looking for solutions, particularly with that lens around inclusion as well? And so, another, company that's really kind of moving forward in this space is Queerly Health. And, once again, looking at, populations in the LGBTQ community who, once again, traditionally have been underrepresented when it comes to access to quality care. And so they are creating resources, they're creating platforms, they're creating community for these kinds of needs. All right, next slide, please. And once again, I love, just kind of shining a spotlight on some of the companies that are working in the space, that are producing the companies that are working in these spaces, just to give you a sense of how the market is moving. And once again, why it's so important, because, once again, the landscape is shifting. If you're not meeting the needs of communities and showcasing that in your leadership and representation, there's a real impact around the longevity of companies and trust. So here, you have Mommy, led by Melissa Hanna, who, actually was invested in by Serena Williams, right? So this is that whole ecosystem and cycle of how things are moving right now, right? Serena Williams had that tragic kind of experience around her pregnancy and delivery, and is now seeing the kinds of companies that are meeting that need. And Mommy is around maternal health and technology and making sure that there's access to better care around that. And very much what Melissa is, being a leader around is, really addressing a lot of the disparities. And so Mark Cuban and Serena Williams have invested in this company, and they're growing amazingly, right? You have, once again, Henry Health, or, accelerators like Rock Health and Startup Health that are, creating and helping to guide these companies into launch, right? So, they're there, right? Like the companies, the spaces, the people are making this a reality. And that's, once again, why it's so critical that we have this perspective. Next slide, please. So let's dig into just kind of getting it done. As we're thinking about leadership and growing the workforce and our talent communities, and making sure that we are, moving toward activities that build more of an inclusive culture inside of our companies, here are a couple different thoughts that, that you can bring, whether that's that you being in a leadership position, or once again, if you're on a committee, if you're able to roll that up at all. Here's some kind of pointers to keep in mind. So once again, assessing leadership intention and buy-in is so absolutely critical. That's why I had this as the very first bullet here, because once again, these are the kinds of concepts that need to be built into the DNA of companies, right? And so, while there could be a couple different ambassadors or people who are, mentioning that this is a need, that this should be kind of looked at, oftentimes until it is recognized by leadership, and then things get rolled out intentionally, is when real change can happen. So the first piece is so critical around assessing leadership intention and buy-in, understanding the responsibility and resources that need to be applied. So once again, there are one-off things that can be done, but once again, if we want to do this effectively and for the long haul, just having that responsibility around, what kind of resources are going to be taken into account to really kind of build this into the culture, into HR, into recruiting. That's the deep dive that's critical to making sure that this is done properly. And that leads really well into that next bullet around investing in, the companies or, organizations that that focus on this, right? So if you know that, you may not have the resources or the capabilities or the insights to do this properly at your organization, I can't stress enough that it's so critical just to, bring this to bear around, having an organization and that can actually help you and the organization understand in depth, where the gaps are at your company, what are the best practices, and what a roadmap might be to do it effectively. It will save you so much time and headaches when you work alongside of expertise. And this next piece around sourcing to retention, right? Oftentimes, the narrative around, okay, we don't know where to go to find people. Once that gets done, once you start building relationships, with the right platforms, with the right people, to really kind of open up and expand, your circles around sourcing, that's where a lot of this begins, right? Oftentimes, there's that, especially in the startup space, you rely on kind of like your friends or colleagues that you went to school with and things of that nature, but that is limiting in itself, right? So, working alongside of platforms that are already speaking or already growing talent communities can be extremely beneficial to opening up your sourcing circles. And this goes all the way to, the hiring process and also retention, is making sure that, you have a really kind of good perspective around the total aspect of talent development in your workforce, right? So all the way to retention is going to be absolutely critical. And then the final two, regular leadership accountability, right? Having quarterly or monthly check-ins, around, the data related to your talent or your culture and things of that nature are extremely important to make sure that you're on task for the long haul. And then finally, the piece around culture building is extremely important for that retention piece as well. All right, next slide, please. So once again here, I mentioned, investing into the workplace to do this properly. So once again, looking at diversity, inclusion, and belonging, really making sure that if you're going to be intentional about doing this properly, that you bring in the right partners, and really kind of take a long look at what you want to do over the next, several years and how to map that backwards to these kind of areas as well. Culture and community. So, especially looking at various, I guess, generational groups for the workplace, increasingly, with millennials, especially Gen Z, the aspect of culture and, and belonging is so incredibly critical because it's not just getting a paycheck anymore, oftentimes for these generations, but it's really, how does this company align with doing good in the world, or how do I show up and how am I being represented, throughout the year, and so culture and community is such an important aspect to think about. And once again, this is where you start looking at, how your HR, lineup starts looking, and investing in people that can lead these kind of initiatives, as well as, investing in talent and HR, particularly from that kind of training piece to like make sure that they understand all these kind of aspects around the hiring process as well. Next slide, please. And just to recap here, what's at stake overall and what we can all kind of focus on is, these are direct outcomes that are at stake right now, right? We talked about, things like, maternal mortality, and these are all the things that, once again, affect all of us, right? It affects our friends and our family. So as we start thinking about these kind of long-term solutions, these direct outcomes are closely linked to the leadership and the workforce that we have, working on these solutions. The next one around employer brand and workforce upskilling. Once again, as companies everybody's a brand now, right? So as you start thinking about, who you want, building your team or who you want coming onto your team, once again, people are looking to see whether they're represented. What are your values? What's the mission? How does this all tie together? And then finally, opportunities for sustainable innovations and solutions. So with a diverse and inclusive workforce, it only makes sense that, the innovations and the solutions and the products are going to reflect deeply the solutions that are needed among the communities that we're focused on helping. So just really quickly, what we're doing at Onboard Health. I know that we touched on that a little bit earlier with Bray. You can definitely go to the next slide. Once again, we are really focused on building a more diverse and inclusive workforce ecosystem to power the future of health. Really creating, on one hand, a talent community of people that have backgrounds in data science and UX and design thinking and communications and behavioral science, all those kind of various things, and bring that all together for people to have a sense of community around what they're doing. And so there's that talent community, and you can move on to the next slide, that we've seen has been really important. So the three kind of main pillars for what we're doing here at Onboard Health is to connect, equip, and launch, connecting like-minded individuals and practitioners and professionals together, equipping them with the resources and tools that they can do their job better, and then launching them into amazing roles and opportunities to continue building the future of health. Next slide, please. And how we're kind of working in, with organizations, or working with, venture-backed startups and larger organizations, specifically around senior and executive talent, because that's where we feel really kind of moves the needle on a lot of the initiatives that we're seeing in a lot of the companies that are building the future of health. So we're really focused on making sure that leadership reflects the diversity of our society, and that ultimately creates the inclusive and sustainable future of health that we need to have right now. And just this quote from Brene Myers, who's now over at Netflix, doing this work around diversity and inclusion. Diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to the dance. And I think, just to add a little bit more of a public health and healthcare context, the next step is making sure that everybody gets home safely from the party, has designated drivers, and are making sure that they're washing their hands for 20 seconds when they get home. Thank you so much.
Great advice. Okay. So thanks so much, Andre. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the practical applications. So I work at Evidation Health, and we're a company that finds new ways to measure health in everyday life using wearables, apps, sensors. We've got just a growing workforce of data scientists and engineers and digital operations specialists and consumer engagement specialists. And it's, it's incredibly important to create this culture and have diversity and inclusion be part of your foundation. And so, Jen, if you would actually skip the next slide and just go to the core values slide, I think maybe that's best use of our time. So Evidation is basically committed, and one more click, please, to embracing these values every day. So these are our core values, and we have them on the wall in all of our workspaces, and something that we actively talk about every day, embracing diversity, and that's race, ethnicity, background, LGBT, and we really focus on treating others with dignity and respect, and just being curious and being open and learning about other cultures and other backgrounds. And then we tend to ask a lot, which voice is in the room, who should be at the table that isn't at the table. And Jen, if you can go back to now slide 29. So some of the things that we do, our C-suite is incredibly diverse. So not only is the workforce diverse, and we're intentional, I think, in our hiring, the C-suite is diverse, the SVP level is diverse, the VP level is diverse. And so we really look at diversity, and it's a broad concept as, who we are as a company, and not just a quota. And something that is, I think constantly going on that we're trying to build is that culture and that we're constantly seeking, ideas and, what are the needs from the employees. And so it's very much a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. And then we also, measure, whether it be employee experience surveys, doors always open at HR to check in on people and how their experience is, and then crowdsourcing ideas. And then something that I should have just put in broad highlight that is a responsibility of all of us is really to working to end the privilege access. I am in too many rooms. I've gotten to the point in my career where I serve on a number of boards and committees, and oftentimes you get invited because somebody knew you. And if that's the only way to get in, it's going to be really hard for us to create the workforce that we're looking for. And so I think we have to really be intentional. In academia, I call it academia land. I feel like we tend to give the opportunities to the people who've had the most opportunities and who've been, quote unquote, the most successful in bringing in grant dollars. And so a lot of, it's hard to get a seat at the table. And so we really have to shake up, those hierarchical paradigms and make sure that we're getting everybody a seat. And then, as Andre was talking about, building the pipeline, whether it be Evidation or my husband owns a small tech company, and they work in aerospace engineering, and they're constantly looking, they find great talent and they're excited. When he made his first minority hire, he was very excited because it had been traditionally a very white male company, and then they were looking to, have more women involved, and even at the, at their C-suite and in their senior level. But then it was like, where do I find these people? And I think it's more of a, where do you build these people? How do people who are coming from backgrounds where they might have a harder time accessing education or getting student loans or getting these opportunities, like we need to look back earlier in the pipeline and make sure we're building it and not just waiting to pluck the talent once, the most successful who were able to get over all of those obstacles magically appeared in the workforce. So I just encourage everybody to think back and really think about, what's the talent that you're investing in early in the pipeline. So those are my Evidation specific comments. So I'd love to talk, Andre, I've got a couple questions for you, and we'll see if people start chatting questions in. But I feel like some of my friends that are from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds who do get a seat at the table and did make their way into the workforce in the way that they want, end up being responsible for diversity, and they're on all kinds of committees that I feel like is almost an extra burden. So how do you navigate that tension and those expectations that are put upon folks?
So that's a great question, Bray, and I've personally been a part of that as well. But I think once again, as we think about diversity and inclusion, it's not just for people of color or people from traditionally underrepresented groups, right? Like it's for everyone to build this together, right? And so once again, we think about allyship and things of that nature as well. I think the most important piece here is going back to that leadership buy-in and intention. So oftentimes there might be I'm sure we've seen chief diversity officers being put up into companies and having that role created, and oftentimes it is not tied directly to, business development objectives, right? Or hiring, right? So once again, getting away from the concept of saying like, hey, we have this, committee here just for people to talk amongst themselves is oftentimes, a huge misstep. So once again, even before you launch any kind of committee, or even if you want to reevaluate what you have going on now, really take a good hard look at what you want to come out of these kinds of meetings and discussions, and making sure that it's once again tied directly to leadership and where the company is going and how the direction of culture is built, and making sure that the people that you bring to the table are not just the underrepresented people at your company, but it involves everyone. But once again, really focus on making sure that it's tied directly to where the company can actually make moves with.
Yeah, those are such important ideas. Jen, I know we're getting down to our last few minutes. I'm looking in the chat, and I don't see a question in the chat. Would you like us to switch into the wrap-up slides?
Yeah, let's do that. I want to be respectful of your time, both as experts and presenters, and also folks who have dialed in and listened. This was tremendous. Andre, I have a solid page and a half here of chicken scratch that certainly we'll be taking forward into our efforts at Dime. Bray, I really liked you sharing your sort of applied vision of how you guys are striving to do this at Evidation and just sort of embed that in the culture. Also, Andre, a shout out, I subscribe to the Onboard Health newsletter and I find that incredibly valuable and enjoy reading it every time it hits my inbox. So for folks on the line today and also listening to the recording, for anyone who is passionate about that topic, I highly recommend that you subscribe to the Onboard Health newsletter. It's incredibly valuable. Very quickly, before I wrap, just a quick overview of topics coming up. We have our lightning speed crowdsourcing half-hour discussion. Truly is quick fire. That's coming up on March 26th. And the topic there, the focus of this is engaging patients in all the work we do in digital health and digital medicine. So a really important continuation of making sure we have the right people at the table always. Next month, our webinar, I'm really excited about this. We have Lucia Savage and John Wilbanks joining us as we launch Dime's Federal Comment Toolkit. Obviously, there's a lot of evolution in policy and regulation right now. We really want everyone who these new digital medicine policies affect to be participating in the rulemaking process, and we have a new toolkit to support that. And then finally, we have our next virtual journal club, which is Brene Bent and Jessalyn Dunn, and they'll be talking about sources of inaccuracy in optical heart rate sensors. They did some tremendous work that's just been published, and they'll be talking with members about that. So with that, Andre, Bray, incredible presentation today. My apologies again that I had some technical difficulties at my end, but you guys were champs as far as I could tell. Everyone listening on the line, thank you so much for being part of this important discussion. Appreciate you being here, listening to this, and I look forward to some stories of Andre, how everything we learned from you today is sort of affecting folks in the workplace and how we all go ahead and implement it.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Tremendous. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.